Good afternoon. My name is Scott Sage. This is my partner, Andy Lever. We're from Crane Venture Partners, which is an early stage data and enterprise fund focused on investing at the seed stage in Europe. So from here in Dublin, all the way across to Helsinki and south. We're based in London, although Andy has been spending a lot of time in the US and Japan over the last 2 decades. Very privileged to have Andy on stage with us today. He's literally one of a kind. He has internationalized 7 iconic US software companies from sub 10 million in ARR up to 100 million plus, 6 of those through IPO, and has hired thousands of people across Europe and Asia, and is going to talk about some of his experiences as an operator, building companies, and from my perspective, investing into companies. So I'll run through some research that Andy and I have been pulling together over the last 5 years since we met when he was scaling Workday, and then Andy will walk you through some of his lessons learned, and we'll take questions. We're using Slido, if anyone wants to pop any questions up on that, and then we'll answer those at the end. So Andy and I have worked with a selection of these companies here, and the first thing is, you don't always get it right. I remember the first company that I joined the board of that had actually started internationalizing a few months before I joined the board. I took over from a partner at another fund, and they were 6 months into opening up their New York office from London, which was a catastrophic failure. We had an emergency injection of capital within 6 months of joining the board, which wasn't a lot of fun. But some of the perspectives that we'll be sharing with you today are from working with some of these companies. And for those of you in the room, can I get a show of hands? How many are building software companies from here in Europe that were headquartered here to begin with? Okay, and then any of you from the US? Okay, most of our talk is some of it can be cross-pollinated, but most of it is from going from the US, from Europe to the US. And you'll recognize a lot of the companies here in Europe. No single company has a prescriptive path to internationalizing your business. Historically, a lot of the Nordic companies might open up an office from Helsinki and go to Stockholm or Copenhagen or even Berlin first. A lot of British companies might go from London to Dublin to Paris and Berlin. And what we're seeing more and more of is companies going from their headquarters, wherever it might be here in Europe, to the US first, because it's still the largest single market for purchasing software. And obviously, you'll recognize a lot of these players. I think Andy and I's belief is one of the greatest trends that's happening now is that you can build a software company from anywhere in the world. You have access to open source software, the internet, and know-how in almost every single country from people who have built and shipped products. And so several years ago when I met Andy, I was asking myself, I was basically hitting my head up against the wall saying, why is there no research on when companies internationalize? How do they internationalize? How big are they? How much have they raised? Where do they go first? And so step 1 in this process was looking at every single S1, and S1 is a filing document for a company that's preparing to go public. And they have to disclose 3 years of financial and operating metrics. And part of that was taking out the financial revenues and then splitting them out by geography. And we didn't get the numbers for every single company. We don't know the exact date for some of these companies, but we have pretty good statistics from this first data set of 69 companies, 8 of which were originally headquartered outside of the US. What Andy and I are busy working on now is doubling the size of this, and we're going back further in time, pre-1995, adding not just cloud companies and SaaS businesses, but older generation software companies which have now transitioned to SaaS models, and obviously we'll be including all the latest batch of IPOs. And from this set of 69 companies, just to give you a bit of context, most of these companies took them about 10 years to get to 100 million in revenue, roughly 10 years to IPO. Most of them were growing on average about 40% a year from 2015 to 2016. If you take out the top 15 companies, they're growing on average about 80% a year. So these are still best-in-class, very fast growth companies running SaaS models. And it was really perplexing to find that almost the majority of them were choosing London as their first international city. These are for the companies that started in the US. We thought there would be quite a few more in Dublin, quite a few more in the Netherlands. They used to have really great tax breaks for software companies a decade ago. We'll see what happens going forward with Brexit and the great de-globalization that we're going through now politically. But for the non-US companies, what's really interesting is that to start with, 4 out of the 7 of them chose the East Coast. When you dig into that, Atlassian was one of those that went from Australia to New York. They very quickly packed up their bags and went to San Francisco because it failed. Zendesk did the same. They went from Copenhagen to Boston. I think they spent a winter there, which is actually more brutal for anyone who's been to Boston than Copenhagen. I think they lasted 6 months and went to San Francisco. And what Andy and I are seeing anecdotally now with our own portfolio is looking at the East Coast first, especially for companies that are on the continent or in the Nordics. If you think about the time difference from Stockholm to San Francisco, it's almost impossible to have a productive day when you're needing to communicate with a product manager or marketing or sales back to the home office, especially with engineering. And so the poor head of product is typically traveling back and forth every 2 weeks and never gets to see his family. On how big companies were in terms of revenue the year before they started to internationalize, again, this was really interesting. About a third of them had about $10 million or less in revenue. If you look at the ones who went the earliest at less than $5 million, Salesforce, if none of you have ever read Mark Benioff's book, it's a brilliant book. He talks a lot about how they designed the company very early on with the first version to be translatable into any language and be localized. And so they very much thought about going global from day one, and I think for the product management and engineering team, that's really important to think about. But sorry about the design here, from a time period, the latest cohort of companies the youngest companies that were founded between 2006 and 2011, what's interesting is if you look at the time it took them to launch their first office, the pace is accelerating rapidly. Roughly 3.5 years for them to launch their first international office. Again, I think an interesting trend that we're looking at, and I think this is probably relative to a lot of the companies in this room, a lot of the newer companies are selling to their end users. So HubSpot's selling to a marketing manager at a mid-sized company. Zendesk is selling to the head of customer support. The other companies are selling directly to developers, and I think we all know that the developer is the new king. So a lot of these aren't having to get lost in long sales cycles, selling through the CIO. Obviously, if you look at security companies, it's slightly different with longer sales cycles selling into the CISO. What's more interesting, though, I think, is looking at the non-US companies. And this data for the public companies is also similar to what Andy and I are seeing with the latest batch of companies that we're investing into or that we look at investing into. In Europe, most companies are internationalizing typically around year 2 or 3. For those that do get to product market fit in Europe, they're typically launching into the US at somewhere between $2 and $5 million of ARR. That's on average. And one of my favorite stories is actually from Christina from TalkDesk. I don't know if she's in this room, but when I interviewed her for part of this study a couple of years ago, she was saying one of the reasons why we launched in the US initially and kept engineering in Portugal is because if we built our initial product for the Portuguese market, we actually probably wouldn't be around today. We were pushed really hard to create the most innovative product that we could from very aggressive buyers, and ultimately that's how they got to 10 million pretty quickly. We call that the Israeli model, where you keep engineering in your home market. And that's a huge strategic asset that we look at when you're building a company, because your CapEx and OpEx is typically a lot lower with the cost of developers here. And if you can get the cadence right and communication right between selling into the US market and building product back home, then that's a huge asset, I think, that can allow you to move even faster against some of the bigger US companies. So Andy's going to come up now and talk about some of the lessons he's learned in scaling some of the software companies he's been involved with.
Thanks, Scott.
Cheers.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Dublin. I spent a lot of time here drinking Guinness, building out Workday, and they're taking me out again tonight, so I've written off tomorrow pretty much. So as Scott said, I spent a lot of time with Scott helping interview companies that have scaled. And what I wanted to talk about is, and it's interesting here, in the title, we talk about break it to make it. So Scott was very kind in his intro. I've been very fortunate to work with some companies that have scaled very, very quickly through hypergrowth, through IPO, and there's a lot of war stories that go with that as well. So when we say break it to make it, there's a kind of old rule of thumb, which is when you hit the ones and threes, 1 million, 3 million, 10 million, 30 million, things tend to break. And what I mean break is that repeatable process that you have for sales, for marketing, for customer success, whatever it may be, needs to be reinvented, the leadership needs to be reinvented, and the customers demand more. So as a part of that, when you get to your first international market, what do we see in place before you start thinking about that? So first of all, repeatable sales execution at home. I wouldn't even think about going outside of your home market until you've really nailed down at home how you sell repeatably. Early international customers, so for instance, you may have a global that you've sold to, they have divisions in other countries, so by proxy, you've been in those markets. So if you sold out of the UK, they would have a division in the US, you've typically involved those in the rollout somewhere. So use those to learn as much as you can. Graduated from selling to early adopters, what does that mean? So I always say that when you get your very first customers, there's always a story of you're selling on TCO, total cost of ownership. And what does that mean? That is, I can do this faster, better, cheaper than somebody else. A lot faster and a lot better and a lot cheaper than somebody else. Those early adopters love that. They want to be the people that are really the tip of the spear. That message will move as you grow. Very quickly as the product matures, as your stories get richer, the value comes in, and your sales message will pivot from TCO to ROI because you have the war stories. I hear time and time again from young companies where they say, the sales guy doesn't do anything. It's the pre-sales guy. He's telling all the stories about the product. Trust me, that shifts over time as you get more and more of those stories. The sales guys become enriched with more and more customer content. And then finally, understanding of local culture. I get approached a lot about, hey, I need to hire the first guy in market for company X. This is what we want to pay, this is the package, this is what we'll do, and we'll put them on a US contract. Let me tell you, typically that won't work, okay? So do a bit of research in terms of what is the market, what's the expected culture there in terms of what you need to do to get that person on board and make them feel happy. They're taking a massive risk being the first person to join your company. They're your brand ambassador as well. You screw it up, there's a lot of damage done that you need to undo later on in the market. So with that said, what are one or two of the stories that we heard? I just want to share these with you as well. So, grow fast or die slow. And this is a very good adage. If you're really, really leading that category, especially in enterprise software, you'll find that you're doubling or tripling every year for the first few years. Now, what I mean by that is everybody so far, I've only been here a day, that I've heard talk is very much new business sales, new customer acquisition. That's really important. That's the very front end of the sales process. The bit that often gets forgotten is in a land and expand model, how do you expand? How do you add value? What is the cross-sell, upsell? How do you segment the sales force to make sure that you're taking advantage of those opportunities? And the bit at the back end, so when I first got into SaaS, I was very fortunate to work with some of the very first SaaS companies like Ariba and SuccessFactors, is the renewals process is often forgotten on both sides. And the buyer as well, who is negotiating with you as a new business customer, will forget about the whole process. Let me tell you real quick as well that when you get to renewals, typically if you're signing a 1-year contract, if you're lucky 3, from the time of signing the first deal, 1 year later, your product will be substantially richer. You'll have added features to it, you'll have added new things to it that are typically driven from your customer advisory board. Don't be afraid of putting up prices. The value has gone up over that year. Everyone's always worried that the buyers always say, well, technology's got much cheaper. This should be getting cheaper, shouldn't it? Because I can go to AWS and buy that substantially cheaper now as well. The complete opposite is true. All the companies I've been at, we've substantially put up prices. There's been hard conversations, but trust me, if they're coming back to buy from you again during the renewal process, look at the value you're creating for them, and the sales guy should be talking about that. So you've got to think about all the segments of revenue that drive this growth, and at that tipping point where your renewals revenue overtakes your new customer acquisition is always an interesting debate in companies as well. So culture. I'm sure everybody here has been to a very high-performance organization, and they've probably walked out thinking, what a weird culture, okay? There's some very quirky cultures out there. And I always equate that this is driven a lot from the leadership team, and I kind of always tell this story. You can't tell people to work harder. You just can't tell people. They either feel it or they don't feel it, okay? And you see time and time again that the fingerprints of that culture causes this high expectation within the organization. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy within the organization. But 2 warning signs. So first of all, and this is someone from INSEAD that I follow, who I think comes out with some very wise words now and again on Twitter, is people watch you with culture. And the first one is very interesting. How you treat people that leave is very interesting. I've seen, if you look at the big 5 SI companies, they treat the alumni as like an extended family, and they use that as a way to actually progress their brand into the market. I see a lot of young tech companies treat it like a religion. If somebody leaves, they're banished from the family forever, never to be spoken to again. That is really damaging, trust me. They feel bad, and they will tell everybody that they feel bad. So, number 1 story that we heard. Number 2 is, if people see number 1, then guess what? I'm going to pretend I'm part of the culture. And we've all got these in organization, by the way. Of course I love the culture. I don't really, because I saw what you did to that guy. So I'm actually not really engaged. So culture and employee retention and just employee efficiency, you need to think very carefully about that extended family. And I hear this word at the conference a lot, community, and having spent time with Hortonworks and building open source communities where you're relying on that extended family, I think is becoming more and more important than ever. So this, when you're a young company, I think is massively important. The one thing that differentiates you as a young company from a mega vendor is, and I use this line time and time again, is when you meet a prospect, they'll say, hey, I just had mega vendor X in here. They can do it cheaper, they can put more resource on it, they can do all of these things that you can't. And it's probably all true, okay? But here's what they can't do. They can't give them a highly personalized experience where you are so intrinsically tied to that success of the project that your company relies on that project being successful. With Mega Vendor, they're queue position 562. With you, they're queue position 1. So this customer success, I can't stress enough how important it is that you're fanatical about those early customers being successful. And that creates what I call the 3 Rs. The renewals, of course I'm going to renew, yeah? Referrals, I'm going to tell everyone about how great you are and the job that you've done. And finally, references. So if you think about the sales engine, your marketing, your inside sales, and your sales, and how they're connected together, that flywheel, the thing that comes back out the other end are referrals and references that feed straight back into marketing and probably drive a lot of your content marketing strategy. So be fanatical about customer success. Every company I've been in, it's not just fanatical about sales. And by the way, every company has a dominant culture. There'll be one part of the organization that's dominant over the other, typically driven by the founders, there's some that have to be dominant to the organization, full stop. It can't just be sales, it can't just be engineering. Customer success spans across every part of the organization. Another one that we heard as well is hey, we've got 25 customers and we're about to land this huge customer. They're massive, they're going to change the company forever. But this customer says, I want to invest some of my personal intellectual property IP in your code line, but I want it to stay proprietary. I don't want anyone else to benefit in that. Can you change your product line so that it goes off and puts these things into it? Don't do it. Trust me, you'll have debates internally. You'll be bedazzled by the dollars. Don't do it. Once you stray and you start becoming, as a young company, more and more wedded to a particular customer and that they retain the IP, it will be damaging in every other further customer conversation. So be very clear up front, I feel, in terms of the extensibility of your product, where they can customize. And customize is a horrible word in SaaS, by the way. It's really how they can configure. So that extensibility of configuration within the product. And train sales on that. Sales guys will always come back and say, if we do this, this, and this, they'll buy. But you're mortgaging the future of the company. So I've been pretty fortunate. So I've worked with some companies that when you look at the entire proposition, you look at it sometimes and you think, so what? The so what test. Why do I care? So I look at Ariba, one of the first companies in SaaS that I work with. So this is selling how to buy indirect materials for a company cheaper to people typically sat in the basement that want to squeeze an extra penny out of buying pencils. Sounds pretty boring, right? And that company was acquired for over $4 billion by SAP. So what did they do different? So I've seen through every company I've been with where they have absolutely nailed their category definition and supersized it above everybody else to give a vision that is all-encompassing. So often, I get pitched all the time by typically sales enablement, sales proficiency type companies, and they call me up and they tell me about all the features they have, and 99% of the time it's not very interesting. When they're solving a really, really big, gnarly problem and it supersizes everything else, it really does grab that category. And if you can test that with very friendly customers or very friendly analysts, you typically end up really changing the game, supersizing it, and it is the winner takes all. So very fortunate to work with people who've done very large category definitions with a lot of US companies, and you see it time and time again. So with Ariba, we came up with spend management, which within weeks, the competitors had copied and put all over their website, and then within weeks after that, Gartner created a whole magic quadrant around it. Everybody then wanted to buy spend management. It had never existed before. So creating that category that supersizes it really is a winner takes all. So, and I don't know how much has been talked about this here. I think I heard one presentation earlier. Everybody thinks of customer acquisition as very sequential. You know, you cold call them, they put the phone down, so you send them an email, and then they reply, and then you get a meeting with them, and then the sales guy eventually goes and meets with them, etc. For your ideal customer profile, whatever that may be, your ICP, you may have heard that acronym, you need to think about this as, we call it social selling, which is how do you engage everybody in parallel to orchestrate the touch points that you need with that customer to make sure you get them on board. And I think now, I see it in meetings often where marketing say, we've generated X thousand leads, and sales go, the pipeline sucks and we're missing our target. You probably sit in those. They completely miss each other. I think now with ABM, and by the way, ABM I think is a bit of a panacea at the moment, so I won't get too sucked into a lot of what people promise, but the whole concept of being able to orchestrate how you get your ideal customer profile, where you touch them, and what those touch points are. So for instance, we've used machine learning now to work out the 7 vital golden touches that you have across taking a call, visiting you at the booth, downloading a piece of content, attending a webinar, etc., that if they happen in a certain sequence, there's a super high probability they're going to become a customer. And speed. So the one thing, I talked about faster, better, cheaper. The one thing that I love, and I'm super impressed by this, is when you have a conversation with somebody and you get an email in your inbox within 10, 20 minutes that lists everything you talked about, what the follow-on steps are, which basically drives me. Hey, we met, we discussed this, we're going to do this, etc. Trust me, the guys, your competitors that have got territories of maybe 50 to 100 accounts who move slow, the next day they're forgotten. Okay, so speed is a competitive weapon when you're a small, nimble company. I see that time and time again where I sit down with C-level execs of prospects and they say, well, you guys were all over it. You know, you straight away you came back to me, you told me what the next step was, you gave me content, you gave me references, you showed me where the content was, and that's a whole way to drive the ABM conversation as well. Speed is definitely a weapon when you're smaller. So just to finish, where does this kind of take us to? So we talked about looking at when to internationalize, when do you scale, what are the kind of war stories you see as you start to scale the organization. And this is what we kind of got it down to. So these are the three traits we saw between ABM, customer success, and trying to drive towards that category king. And by the way, category king is not always obvious as to what that category is. It takes a while to tease that out. And I will give another recommendation is, as leaders in your organizations, often you're so close to the details, you can't see it, the simplicity of what that message needs to be. Categories are simple. They're always simple. If you have to explain it in many, many sentences, it's not a good category, trust me. So with that said, I'll get Scott back up onto the stage and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just go back and optimize some of our self-serve routing, which I'll get another 1 or 2 million.
Do you want to take the first one?
Any advice on how to deal with the legal tax complexities of running a company in two countries? Interesting question, yeah. So there are many ways to set up, I've used in terms of setting up internationally. So you can sometimes use a proxy shell to set up in that company, which means that they will sort out everything for you and you're just kind of buying their service. You can actually set up a legal entity there, which means that you're on the hook for the taxes and benefits and everything that goes with legal employment of people. Or the other way is, and I didn't talk about this in my presentation, is to think about how could you set up a JV distributor type arrangement where maybe you own 49% or less, where you don't actually have to take on board all of the tax and legal complications that go with it. So there's kind of benefits and pros and cons to each approach, but you want to think about how much exposure you want to that market in terms of legally, one, paying taxes, but two is what you need to put into people's contracts and the benefits that you need to pay people. So there's a couple of options there.
George has asked, at what stage ARR do you think localization should really kick off? George, if you're still here, is localization, are you talking about product localization? I'll assume that you mean product localization. We have a few companies, actually, we were speaking to a week or two ago in the US who were looking at coming to Europe, and they had a 6-month lead time, I think, for localizing a pretty big platform shift to do things like currency, language, etc. Obviously, if you're going to places like Japan or Southeast Asia, completely different UI and UX, and that's something you actually should definitely hire someone from the local community to build with you. And so if your proxy team, let's say it's a founder, someone who's in charge of focusing on the internationalization, and maybe a board member, are in the early phases of planning what the international rollout should look like, where you're going, how you execute it, then I think you should roughly at the same time get the engineering team to start thinking about what needs to go into localizing the product, so at least there's a plan, so that when sales and marketing or a GM is on the ground in the new market, you're not scrambling with, oh shit, 6 months later we still don't even have a product to sell here even though we have people on the ground. So I hope that answers the question. Maybe talk about the category, because I think that's so topical right now, Andy.
Can you, can you expand a bit on defining a category with an early stage company, say Series A? So there's actually a very good book on this that I would recommend people read called Play Bigger. It's on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle as well. It talks about how to think about the steps that you go through as you grow to defining that category. And there's two different scenarios. There is the scenario where you're disrupting an existing market. So I talked about Ariba. So you would think, hey, with a sale of over $4 billion, they nailed it, they owned the category, it was theirs to take. Then along comes this company called Coupa, has a $1 billion IPO, and seemingly does the same thing. But they found the wedge, as they call it, the wedge to disrupt the existing incumbent, which was they looked at how buyers, suppliers interact across the network, and they found out that there were economies of scale that they could get, and they used that to build a bigger category to now go in and say, hey, there's a new way of thinking about this. So you can think about disrupting existing categories and what are you doing to do that. For a brand new category, which is more evangelical, it's harder, because typically people don't know what it is and there's a lot of education to go through. I could talk a lot about this, but I would recommend have a read of that book. The guy who wrote it has worked with a couple of my companies in the past and has done just a supreme job of elevating the conversation to make sure that when you go out to market, and We used to use, there's kind of some gnarly journalists who've been frazzled by the industry or super skeptics that I use, and I pitch them, and they pretty much throw things in my face pretty quickly if they think it doesn't work. So you need the hardest, horriblest audience to pitch this to when you think you've got it as well. But take a look at that book. It's worthy of a whole discussion or stage presentation in itself.
We have 30 seconds left. Let's see if we can rattle through. What's the current biggest fad to avoid? Consumer internet, build a SaaS company. Is there ever a scenario where you would back altering the product for the first big customer? Perhaps if you keep the IP. Oof, I wouldn't.
If there's an opportunity for you to put it into the main code line and make sure that everybody benefited for it, and you knew that other customers would want a similar sort of scenario, so it's maybe vertical specific, say financial services, and you know that that's the way people operate, then yes, there's a possibility. I wouldn't touch it otherwise, personally.
Cool. We're around for the next hour or so if anyone wants to catch up, maybe backstage. So thank you. You've been a great audience. Appreciate it.
Perfect.